What was it that was missing? What was it that was missing? Something was, surely, sure as shutterbugs. A shift had taken place. But where? I counted up the plastic candles. 10 burnt out, 11 hanging on, 4 gone to flicker, all the same. Everything in its place, all gone to stop, clocks included. Was something moving? I'd spin on my heels and keep pacing. No. Everything was decidedly unchanged. Next to exceptions, none to be had. So what was the grift? Why should everything about my home take on the way of a prop? It was as if every object in my possession had been replaced with an exact replica, the only difference being that their usual silence had been replaced by an unfamiliar kind, that knew it was being heard, and it was deafening. The jade and copper lamp cut the same shapes as always, a circus of paradolic life cast up and around the corners of the room. That mechanical organ with all its bells and whistles remained silent, fat with unplayed rags. Little mechanical figures behind its foggy glass played out a night scene, but they too kept still. I saw on the joints, the hinges, every possibility of play that might occur should they be so blighted as to spring to life. I span on my heels and kept pacing. Night scene. Yes, that was it. How long had it been night, after all? I slicked back my hair, pausing with my fingers rending at the scalp, and I counted. 6,221 cigarettes. A point of reference. Whenever I smoked, I was inclined to shine my shoes half the time, pace the remainder. If I had just had my shine and 2 smokes, or the other way around, these effects still lingered. I'd be given to pace twice as long. With my shoes all button black, I'd cap it off with a smoke. Pacing was such grand rapture. I'd go for 20 a round, because you ought to cut it somewhere. Half the time it'd just lead to more pacing. If not, I'd light one up. Only 3 times did I go straight back to a shine. But as I'd pace, I'd slowly scuff my shoes, leaving me exponentially more likely to give him a shine. 80 paces in a shine that'd always lead to smoke. First the flicker light, then the little red bug at the end of the line. One good sizzle to the chemistry, switches pulled under my hair, then ta-ta, I'm walking on clouds. I've always had fine form with the soot. None on my shirt, which I kept neatly pressed and tucked in with 2 buttons undone at the top, cinched nicely at the bottom by the belt, stretched and locked. If I had paced to my liking, I was given to shine. My own immaculate concoction, if I may say so. It was oak galls and dope grease ground up to a paste. One the oxidized work of wasps, the other a means to a slippery end. I dabbed the rag in black and in a smooth rotation scrubbed my shoes to gleam and glamour but never at the seams. And then I'd shine and luster glide to nil, like so. There I'd shine and glide to nil, so there I'd shine and luster glide to nil, so there I'd shine and luster glide to gleam and glop, and I'd shine like so and see my face. That snake knows something. Since I counted my cigarettes, I knew exactly how many times I had shined my shoes, and, by extension, how much pacing I had done, but only in proportion. The facts of my routine slowly began to feel like the nooks and crannies of a shopping bag, dropped by a gale and out of use. Blew down a long, dark corridor, pulled by the whir and draft of unknown currents. To ask of the nature of this wind, or the dimensions and qualities of this place, would be a great example of a very stupid question. But 6,221 cigarettes? In one night? That'd be suicide, and I'd never had time for that. Far too busy, no. I dropped to sleep several times, but none of these attempts had brought about the morning. Only the same dream. 2 gray figures, one in front, the other behind. The 3 of us moved through a dark grove of trees. I have to keep pace, always in lockstep, perfect tempo. Walk along so deep and gray, blessed quiet. None is such in the waking world, different breed entirely. It was quiet of a different kind, like a well-oiled bearing. Cherry-red lips sprang out from the dark, seized by a voice in verboten verbatim, of old seeping of baby eyes and sweet berry skins, forced out doe-eyed to taste of themselves. It sputtered, choking on its words, unable to keep up with their sheer velocity. Its voice dragged itself into a terrified accelerando until finally breaking out into a scream in a hollow chord. Sometimes I'd wake up to hear the door softly close. No one out there. That was it. That was the only autonomous sound. In fact, it was the only change, other than those moments when I'd notice funny objects while pacing. Something moving under yellow cloth, a box wrapped many times over in black tape. When I'd turned back around, they'd be gone. The stillness was the rule, until that hand tapped my window. I used to be under the impression that I lived on the 2nd floor. Tap, tap, this was shattered. I hardly saw the hand. Everything I could reckon on it I had gleaned from the texture of its sound. It was a soft hand, held limp, fingers stuck together as if ill-conceived and half-born. Gesture-wise, it was 2 thumps, as if to rouse an animal. Soon the saddest smell would come of this animal, iron gone cold in disuse. I peeked outside. Nothing. Truly nothing. My door, which I had thought to lead out into the hall, only shed an island of light into this unknown space. I stepped out. Nothing but a rickety ledge. Drop-offs on all sides. My apartment itself was undisturbed, bearing the same wrought iron accents and worn white siding as always. However, only the 2nd floor remained, now resembling a ranch house in a vast blackness. I clapped twice, pricking up my ears for the echo. So much hollow space below. Upwards, hard to say. For a moment, the reverberations intermarried, bleeding into one another and finding a new form entirely, an almost living resonance. It would seem that I had been imprisoned. What act could bring about such a turn of events? One could be a prisoner of simple mechanics under snow, rubble, or ash, but when circumstances are so deliberate, one is led to question, was I guilty? If I was, in fact, a prisoner, and not simply trapped, then I must have been. At least of resembling a criminal. True, my name was apt for that sort of work. Tommy Jack Privet. It had that particular rhythm. I'd have been flattered to live up to it. Some marauder moving through the night with big, terrible hands. Maybe I did. True, I had a quality one might call criminal. Something crow-like, eyeing everything with aims to pick apart. Some quiet voltage through a wire pulled tight. This is to say nothing of the switchblade in my pocket. I spun on my heels and went in. There it was, the logic. All I had to figure was which crimes I did not commit. I had to carve bit by bit at the meat of things till the shapes of my hook and crook stood plain before me. Not a jewel thief. I'd always preferred pearls. Couldn't be a killer, because I'd hate to touch anybody. Not an imposter crossing guard. Too scared of oncoming traffic. I once forged harps out of aluminum, but the jig was up when they started sounding too much like the real thing. I couldn't have been lying in some poor man's garden, waiting for him to leave the door open. If I did, I could not have spent weeks in that house beneath his notice, coming out in the wee hours to wear his clothes and mimic his motions like some slow, silent ballet. I certainly could not have finagled the doors to lock from the outside. But I see a vision of this. The rest of him found in jars, his mother screaming on the floor, his lips still talking in the sink. No, never mind. Strike that vision from the record. Parables like that have a way of rising up from the gaps. The narrative mind becomes a phantom limb when there are noises in one's house and nothing in sight. It's forgivable. A story is just an answer and it's Saturday pants. It's not that I didn't remember the events of my life, just that these were sparse eddies in the boundless black. 1,000 fingers had been pointed at that which I did and did not do. So be it, let them point. I span on my heels and kept pacing. Tap, tap, again, but this time more insistent. I locked the deadbolt and lit one up, then surrendered to a round of pacing, sending a ripple through my routines to come. That certain sway of the head with the pivot, just aces high. Fears faded as I was swaddled in repetition. I did feel guilty at exactly one moment in my life, but no one was there to catch it. One morning, back when sights met my window, I woke up before the sun. Fat drops of rain melded in laminar flow. By the glow of a candle, I gathered up my comb, a fruit pie, and a second-hand scrap of a book. With all my implements in hand, I balled up in a crumple in bed, watching the drops come down as I nibbled so vermin-like. I guess I ought to have stirred. I wonder what you would have said had you seen that scene. You always told me that I should allow myself a wish and a vice every now and then. You told me that even the cracking of my neck was a surplus, like a little surprise. I spun on my heels and I stumbled into the bench at the organ, bashing the former into the latter. This typically happened after a round of pacing and a smoke. For the first time, though, the force was enough to knock its works into play. Behind the foggy glass, the little figures cranked their night scene into life, scored only by a single stuttering note. Against a backdrop of varicose purple and swollen reds, a little figure woke up from its chamber, baton in hand, to strike a drum. In so doing, it rang in the worn-out seasons, as portrayed by tiny colored lights. Presiding over the scene was a crescent moon with dead eyes, that old parasite so jester-like. The moon rotated with the boy as his axis, never to release the young man from his gaze. Within the twitching rhythm, the boy popped up, only to return to the depths, and back again, and back again, and back again, never to rest entirely. Blind and drunken faces leered from the backdrop of this unsolicited place, and I could hear the words. Never to be still, but who could call it so that every ream of skin should know those same ceased sins? So that was it. Hammers struck bells to the left. Little notes wriggled out of the woodwork to join the tonic. In time, they even wound themselves into something of a proper tune, depending on the ears to hear it. It was a varied theme, ostensibly in G minor, but given to wild chromaticism. At times, sevenths threw it into a relative major. Rhythmically, it could be said to hang on to the time signature of its backing, 11/16ths at a slow tempo. At times, the tune deviated, eating up its own tail or that of its variations. Through its course, this chromaticism busted out further, fraught and overwrought till I could find no tune to the noise. All was consumed by itself when every note on the keyboard roared, weighed down into a deafening mass in which no note could speak to another. No ratio could be known in this nonsense. Drums struck you fold in to speak the same old clocks which know not what they see, and after them it breathes. Yes, that was it. The fact of my crime. It was simply occupying the role of a criminal in the nature of things. It was simply my spot by a law deeper than words and thicker than blood to be bound in shackles. How dare I be so bold? To ask for a key, however, would be a perfect example of a very stupid question. The music ground to a merciful halt, releasing the drummer from his work. The very last note was blown through a reed and out the mouth of a taxidermy ermine head. Natural causes, I'm sure. Now that the music had faded, I heard what it was drowning out. The tap, 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 tap. This time it kept going. Given what I then understood, it could only be the nature of that hand to seek my window. Out in the dark, knocking. I unlocked and lifted it open. All right. Here and now, I invite you in. Very little out there. On the ledge sat a black bag, filled with something of more or less human size and fetal position. A hole opened up from the inside, such that an eye could see. In form, it appeared to be that of a man. In quality, however, it was solely primordial, like that of a crab. Its pupil shrank to a pinhole in the light. The thing in that bag slowly brought itself to its feet. A leaden growl heaved itself to my ears as if dragged through tar and muck. Night wall. So I flicked open my stiletto and stuck it through the wall. Through the rupture came a steady hiss, like steam through a valve. The man in the bag found its new lips and puppeteered them to say this.
You do to me. Therefore all that crawls to be said, of nothing out the stomach, vice grip and versa, ball unravel, nothing left. Such to give skin to null, by spark of fat, hello, goodbye, hello.
This discourse faded. The body in the bag, now severed from any voice at all, began to frantically contort itself into all manner of empty gestures. In its course, it tore the hole wide open with those half-born hands, revealing only massive, chattering teeth. The jaw snapped at nothing, as if starved of oxygen and seeking the merest wisp, if only. These teeth slowly settled into place like a butterfly perched on a flower. 2 more twitches and it fell, sloughing off the edge like a snowdrift gone to melt. As soon as it was gone, every clock in my home ran a full rotation. The softest ringing seeped in from without. What could be out there? Now, when I tell you this motion happened quick, you've got to understand this was no ordinary trajectory. The door had no initial push and no slowing to a halt. I mean to tell you that this was not quick like some little creature scurrying through the night, just that every unceremonious modicum of its path was placed equally across the smallest fragment of time. Shut and then open. Who was out there? Although there was no road, a man walked to my door. I watched as he grew from a speck to the full form of some well-dressed palooka bearing a lantern. That ringing, aimless and semitonal, followed in tow. His eyes were all too familiar, primordial, almost orange at the whites. I had just seen them. He stepped onto my ledge, reborn from the bag, ready for the next swing of restless pendulum. Only moments ago it was mush in a bag, no rest to be had. In his lantern, a horned beetle scuttled around the candle and stopped to scratch at the glass. The man's skin had the quality of resin, perfectly smooth, We held a gaze like a tightrope between us as he bound his hand evermore in the cord by which he held the lantern. A gale kicked up and blew at his coat. No clue as to what systems could brew up such weather. Not a cloud in sight, and yet here raged a wind as if from some deep wilderness. Across the room, the softest rubbing met my window. He was there too, but not the same. His other face, his putty face, was molded to the glass, yet those eyes were fixed in place, hanging in the air. A single word fogged up my window, his plea for mercy to the nature of things. He was at another window too. There his head was swelling, inflating, pulling away at his neck, so thin like mycelium. Those eyes stayed fixed in place while he sprawled out into an ecosystem of empty gestures and rising skin flowers. Ill-defined wings molded themselves from his ears, rending in opposite directions at what may have been a face. And yet there he remained in front of me. A drop of his face came down on his shoe like wet paint. It was too many times he had plopped out from between the legs of nonsense, only to melt down to gristle again. I could see in those enormous eyes that he wanted to scream. And there was my spot in the swing of things, sealed in a jar of no known circumference. Skin, smoke, shine, sleep, pace, notes, stumble, turn, and all manner of variations branching out thereof, all against that chorus of tortured flesh and howling wind. It was a putrid spring which ate its young. There was a sort of sense to be figured here. Now that he had been invited in, there was nothing else but for the gummed-up works to birth a new cycle. Every melody carries the will to sustain itself, and in its sustenance the potential to burst forth into countless variations, coming in with a shriek and going out twisting. We were to be the crook in a box, and that thing knocking to get in, ad infinitum. These logics were the stuff of those imprisoned in a song. I clapped twice, four-fingered strike on a cupped palm. At this, the man tilted his head quizzically. With a pivot of the left foot, I placed myself behind him, nearly teetering off the ledge. I snapped open my stiletto and cut the cord by which the lantern was held. It clattered to the floor and the bug scuttled off, casting an enormous shadow by the light of the candle. I placed my foot on the man's back and sent him hurtling into the door. Now he was in and I was out. He in front and I behind. Baffled, he felt at this room so strange, like a child in the grips of a night terror before surrendering to sleep. Never before had this thing been in that space. Every ounce of its being was defined by knocking to get in. What then? What after that? No more struggle to be had. My door slammed itself, blowing out the candle in its wake. Just behind me, although there was no road, you came along and scooped up the beetle. You placed one hand in front of the other successively as it crawled before gently leading it onto the windowsill. With your hands free, you unfolded a piece of paper from your pocket many times over. You squinted, trying to read the sprawling map in the dim light from the window. I said, "Here," and I brought my lighter into view, illuminating the tangled network of lines. Flashes of your journeys, of the twisting roads you've traversed, played in my head. I wondered what should occur if your wandering were to stop. You said to me, "Thanks. Is this where you live? Man, I've been very lost." I took a moment, examining those old wrought iron fringes before answering, and I said, No, just passing through." With that, I stepped off the ledge. There is no telling how far I fell, nor if the dark terrace on which I stand is indeed the bottom. I will say this place down here has a heap less light and no noise if any, but I have learned things down here. I've come to figure that even absence has its fill. The silence here is of a particular kind. Like a door just closed and welded shut, even quiet owes something to a sum, filled in by the facts of things, like any tissue or system. From where I stand, I can see why a smidgen of something may sprout up to cut the black. I mourn for those smidgens playing out in the light. I am lucky in some sense, but it's a funny sort of luck that buries one alive. In my home, I was a crook on the hook by the nature of things. Now, I've defied even that. It's a whole different game of figure and ground, and I will say that adds up in a certain way, at least from where I stand. There are worse things.